Hello and welcome back to another one of our leadership series conversations here at State of Reform. My name is DJ Wilson, one of the chief singers and dancers here at State of Reform, and we're excited to jump into this conversation as part of our leadership series with Bhash Parasuraman. She's the Vice President for Value and Access for Rare Disease and Internal Medicine at Pfizer. Pfizer is, of course, a big name in the news over the last year or so, talking about vaccines, and we're excited to jump into this conversation here with you today, Bhash. Thanks for making time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, why don't we just start right off? Tell us, what is gene therapy? I know we may have an idea of what it is, but tell us how you would describe that to us.
Oh, absolutely. So let me just start with very briefly just laying out what genetic diseases are. So our genes are the blueprint of how our body functions. Every cell in our body functions, and they're made up of millions and millions of codes of DNA. And if any one of those codes get damaged, then there's a genetic alteration, which means there's a part of our neuromuscular system, or hemophilia is a disease, is genetic disease. Any part of normal functioning could get impaired, and that's what is called a genetic diseases. Now, why is it important to know that? Because they actually end up causing severe disability and reduces life expectancies. In most cases, especially in rare disease, they are inherited, and they are about 80% of rare diseases are genetic in nature. So moving forward to where's the potential for addressing these diseases. So bringing gene therapy into the equation, science and technology has, today as we look forward into the 2020s and beyond, we are moving away from biologics into potentially editing or changing the way any of these genetic deformities affect patients. And that includes either transferring a functioning or a good gene, as I would call it, and replacing a bad gene. And that helps a patient get back to some level of normal life, potentially 100% normal life. Or there's also other technologies like gene editing. So either way, those are different approaches to gene therapy. They hold the promise of taking a non-functioning or a bad gene and replacing that with a good gene, and therefore giving years of life and quality of life to patient and their families.
So how long has this been a thing? I mean, I remember in the 1990s we were talking about the sort of onset of gene therapy, but this has really become much more commercialized in the last, I guess, few years. Give us a sense of timeline here.
Absolutely. Yes. I think the science, the promise was there for a while. I would say if I look back to when the clinical trials started, 5, 7 years, where again, manufacturers, research centers, academic centers started looking into gene therapy. The first one that came to the market was Luxturna, which is a therapy to change a form of blindness. Again, happens in a small number of patients. The next one that came into the U.S. market was Zolgensma, and that is for a rare disease called spinal muscular atrophy or SMA. These are babies that are born with the spinal cord not being formed. So they often called floppy babies, and many of them end up losing their lives before their first birthday. So there's been, I would say, a lot of progress in the past 3, 4, 5 years, as you said, where some of these therapies have come to market, have come to fruition. So it's still early days for these therapies to finally make it into the market, make it into humans. But if I look at some of the reports coming from MIT Newdigs as an example, I think this decade we're going to see quite a few of them, potentially coming into the marketplace.
Yeah, so on the cusp of really a new world.
Yeah.
What
It reminds me of the biologics, in the early part of the century. So you had ones and twos, and then suddenly the market just came up with so many different options for so many different diseases.
So biologics, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I know biologics, for our viewers, those are much larger proteins. They are much more difficult to produce, sometimes requiring a biological process to develop. And those are running into a lot of policy issues where, the science is ahead of policy making. Give us a sense, Bhash, of whether gene therapy is running into similar policy issues, or whether there are things that we can learn from the biologics conversation and policy that pertain to genetic therapy.
I think, it's opening up. That's what I would say. It's not there yet. Policymakers need to kind of get um, just more on top of it and start accelerating or making changes. So there have been some think tanks, and MIT's been one of them. Duke Margolis is another organization that's been trying to influence through white papers, through membership, um, you know, changes that need to happen, but they haven't happened. I mean, last year there was at least a bill that came out around there needs to be innovative payment models. There needs to be a different mechanism for paying for gene therapies because these are one-time treatments. Unlike most medicines today, even biologics, they are perpetual treatments. Whether you take one biologic, switch it for another, but you take it for the life of the patient for the most part. And it's a paper prescription model of reimbursement that exists with discounts, with rebates, with Medicaid best price, sorry, rebates in place. Gene therapies is a one-time treatment. Now, if you take the years of therapy, a gene therapy, or even years of life, a gene therapy can provide the benefit of, these medicines are not going to be priced the same way as a biologic or even a pill is. These are going to be more expensive, and that's going to create some budget challenges, particularly for Medicaid. And therefore, there needs to be mechanisms or policy changes in place to allow for different payment models, which could include instead of paying upfront, you pay it over time. You watch how the product performs in the real world. The clinical trials will give you rich data, but it doesn't really predict durability. You need real world data. You need real world follow up to look at how the patient is doing over time. There needs to be more investment and sharing of data to look at outcomes in real world. There needs to be the pay for performance. So you tie the payment to actual real world performance. And barriers that exist today for gene therapies as Medicaid best price, as an example, or average manufacturing price, because you're paying for every patient based on an outcome. And if you put in, like, say, Medicaid best price in there, and say, for example, a patient does not achieve a desirable outcome, that payment could be zero. And which means then the best price could become zero. That's a negative scenario for a developer. So I think those discussions need to happen both in Congress, and Congress needs to really enable states to kind of allow them to get into arrangements to pay for performance or pay it over time and have these conversations and discussions and negotiations with developers. So we agree with what's a 3-year payment, a 5-year payment, 7-year payment, etc. Those policies are not there yet, and that's part of the challenge now.
So we're talking about these administrative hurdles, but if I'm a parent today, what about accessing these medicines for my kids or for my spouse? How do I? Where are the conversations today about access to some of these medicines?
I think a large barrier, if one is a parent of a child with genetic disease and the child is covered by Medicaid, it's cross state borders, and we know that many patients do cross state lines and they go to another state for treatment, for hospital, especially to hospitals. These therapies are going to be offered in a hospital setting. There's very low likelihood, probably a zero likelihood, that every state is going to have a center of excellence. So these would be in states where there's a higher concentration of these gene therapy patients, particularly, say, DMD, where there's a large Medicaid population. So as a parent, I would be concerned about taking my child to another state. And what if there's a delay? And because this involves that the state where the parent resides or the child resides would have to agree to pay for hospital rates at the other state. Usually these hospital rates are also lower when patients go out of state. So at the end of it, these policies that exist more for just regular therapies could become a barrier for patients and families because any delay results in the disease getting, progressing. And some of the promise that gene therapies have is they may not completely reverse the disease, but they may keep the patient in a steady state. And DMD is an example of that. So before a patient gets progressively worse, you want to kind of provide them the medicine so that you catch them early. So that is one big problem. The other problem is, of course, coverage, right? If a state is unable to pay, there's a budget impact issue, and the state is unable to get into an arrangement to pay over time or link it to pay for performance, there is no access to therapy.
All right. Well, Bhash Parasuraman, Vice President for Access and Value for Rare Diseases and Internal Medicine at Pfizer. Thanks for making time to talk through this forward-looking topic with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of our leadership series. I appreciate you making time to join us. We'll, of course, have this and other conversations at our site, stateofreform.com. Thanks for watching.